America Foundation. I'm Paul Glastris. I'm a fellow here at the foundation as well as editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly magazine. We have an exciting policy proposal to discuss today. It's a product of the New America's new social contract and economic growth initiatives and part of the foundation's Big Ideas series. I know all about this because I edited the story that in the Washington Monthly, and I thought it important enough that we should put it on the cover of the magazine, which it is this issue. I urge you to read it. I have to say, I've known Phil a long time. We've worked together now probably 20, 25 years. Phil Longman is the author of this story, and he came to me and he said, had he come and said, I want to do a story on mass transit or high-speed rail, I'd have kind of yawned simply because I've read that story. I know the issues. A lot of people know the issues. Great, I'd love to have high-speed rail and so forth. This is not that story. This is a completely different story and extremely well-timed. This is about the quite astonishing benefits of freight rail, something we don't think about much and yet is the backbone in many ways of the logistics of our economy. What's great about it is this is a proposal that does not ask anyone to give up their cars. It's about getting trucks off the road so we can enjoy the driving experience in our cars as much as anything else. And the remarkable benefits in terms of the economy, the energy use, climate change, and so forth. So joining us today to talk about this proposal is a very distinguished panel. We've got John Gray, one of the rail industry's great strategic thinkers. John is a senior vice president of the Association of American Railroads, presides over the Policy and Economics Department. This department manages the various statistical reports of the association and decides the association's stand on various policy matters. It also has the responsibility of conveying these decisions to the government. We are gracious. We are most gracious grateful that John has agreed to join us and to provide his and the rail industry's perspective. Ann Canby serves as president of the Surface Transportation Policy Partnership, STPP, a national advocacy coalition for transportation reform. STPP's goals are to strengthen federal transportation programs that provide options to motor vehicles, enhance the livability of our communities, improve safety for pedestrians, bicyclists, as well as drivers, and provide economic opportunity for people of all ages. She also served as Delaware's Transportation Secretary from 1993 to 2001 and is recognized nationally as a progressive leader in the transportation field. Andre Bassi is Deputy Director of Project Development and Modeling at the Millennium Institute, where he has been working for the last 4 years. Andre joined MI to further develop the energy and environmental programs run at the Institute, and he has been the principal investigator of a number of energy-related projects focused in the United States for EPA, the U.S. Congress, the National Commission on Energy Policy, and various NGOs, as well as on foreign countries such as Canada, Mexico, and Ecuador. Andrea is currently a PhD candidate in systems dynamics at the University of Bergen, Norway, where he received a master's in systems dynamics in 2006. Alan Drake, formerly with Boeing, is a consulting engineer out of New Orleans, where he has been active in reviving the city's storied streetcar system, including the reopening of the Canal Street line and the rebuilding of the rest of the system after Katrina. Great achievement. He is also co-author with Andre Bassi and other researchers of a peer-reviewed study recently presented to the Transportation Research Board, an arm of the National Academy of Engineering. We'll be hearing more about this exciting study in a little bit. And then finally, Phil Longman is a senior fellow at the New America Foundation and also research director for its next social contract project. He's the author of numerous books and articles on public policy, including the forthcoming book, The Next Progressive Agenda. He is the author of the cover story, The Washington Monthly, as I said. So welcome, everybody. I want to also say we've got about 400 people watching us on the web, so we welcome them. And So let's go straight to the presentations, and then we'll have a good Q&A afterwards. John Gray. Oh, no, actually, Phil.
Sorry. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for coming. I mentioned more than a few folks in the room have had this passing fantasy of what would I say if I had 5 minutes alone with Barack Obama in the Oval Office? What could I show him? And today I want to show you my fantasy in action here. So, it's a proposal, kind of like the Swiss Army knife of public policy. What does it get you, this proposal? Dramatic improvements in highway safety, construction, maintenance costs, and congestion costs. It gets you dramatic improvements in energy, greenhouse emissions, public health, shipping costs, and plenty of short-term and long-term economic stimulus. And, as Paul alluded to, nobody has to be priced or guilt-tripped out of their car. So that's what I'm here to sell. The best way to explain this proposal is to begin with a concrete example. In this case, I-81. How many folks in the room know this highway? Okay. Well, as you can see, it basically doesn't go anywhere that people live, right? It starts up in New York, goes to these mid-sized, slow-growing towns, and yet there's 5 million trucks on this road. 1 out of 4 vehicles on this road is a truck, is getting pounded to pieces. And Virginians know they have to do something about this. So the first thought is build more lanes. It's already 4. Build more lanes, that's what highway departments do. But it turns out that it's incredibly expensive. It's a hilly route through a lot of it. You'd have to make a lot of deep cuts. For the same reason, it's a white-knuckle terror to drive, because as you're going uphill, you have to pass the truck, and as you're coming downhill, the truck is passing you. So widening the road is not so good. Put tolls on the road. They floated that idea. Firestorm. Nobody wants that. Truckers don't want that. Everybody hates that idea. No tolls. Fortunately, though, there is another way. Because it turns out that parallel to I-81 are 2 lines owned by the Norfolk Southern Railway. Now, these railroads have seen a resurgence of traffic, specifically trains carrying containers. Now, what's a container? Now, our president has said that it's time to put away childish things, but I want to just cling to this one for a little longer, if you'll bear with me. Okay. For those of you who don't know, we now live in an intermodal world where trucks on the road can just as easily be transported and put on a train and carried that way to their destination or near their destination. And it turns out that there's tremendous environmental advantage to doing this to begin with. The EPA calculates that for a distance of more than 1,000 miles, you get a 65% reduction in greenhouse emissions and in energy use if you just take this trailer to the nearest railhead and put it on the train. So what's the problem? Why are all these trucks on I-81 instead of on the train? Well, the biggest problem is that Wall Street's nuts. Wall Street, while it could have been investing in railroads, was investing the world's savings in subprime and other exotica. And so the railroads have had, even in the glory days of the 90s and earlier in this decade, a very high cost of capital, and they're a very capital-intensive business. And so they were not able to improve the line enough with their own capital to accommodate or divert more of these trailers off I-81. So there's a capacity crunch. And this is true generally around the country. that we have very big increasing volumes of freight on the railroads. At the same time, the amount of track is decreasing. So the railroads could have a lot more business if they only had the infrastructure investment to make it. Now, some far-sighted folks in Virginia that we'll be hearing from later today, I hope, have convinced the Virginia DOT to put a little bit of money into this Norfolk Southern line to improve it. Norfolk Southern's promising with $40 million they can divert 2 million trucks off the road, which is something. But we could do a lot more. Here's the vision of Virginia Rail Solutions, which is an activist group that's done good work in this area to try and get across the concept of what a steel-wheeled interstate could look like. Now, we've only come so far in this concept, but let's just review some of the things that you get just by this sort of modest adjustment in public policy or transportation spending. Trucks are the leading cause of CO2 growth. American industry has declined enough that its greenhouse gas emissions aren't even rising. Trucks up 57% since 1990. Their fuel efficiency has actually declined since 1980, mostly because they're stuck in traffic. The Association of American Railroads estimates that, doesn't estimate, it calculates that 1 ton of freight can go 436 miles by rail with 1 gallon of fuel. So you can move a ton of freight all the way across the country with 1 gallon of fuel. And I told you about the EPA estimate. But it goes beyond that, because there's all kinds of health and quality of life issues. Shortly before Thanksgiving, an 80-year-old grandmother and her 2 grandchildren were killed on I-81 when a semi slammed into them. It was a tragedy, but not an uncommon one. Trucks kill 5,000 Americans every year on the road in collisions. California's EPA estimates that in that state alone, particulates coming out of the tailpipes of trucks kill 1,500 people. Reason Foundation projects that by 2030, peak hour traffic congestions will cause an 89% increase in areas with populations, increase in traffic commute times in major urban areas. So we have to accommodate all that somehow. And Wendell Cox, who many of you will know is a outspoken critic of most mass transit projects, on this issue has a different note. He says that if we could get just 25% of traffic off the road by 2025, that would save the average person 100 hours a year in commuting time. Importantly, rail capacity can often be improved substantially by relatively low-cost measures, such as adding signals, occasional switches. So, let's start with the small-scale stuff that needs to be done. Here we are. There's a tunnel. It goes almost underneath the Capitol building, called the Virginia Avenue Tunnel. It's too narrow for these kind of stack trains to get through. There's another one in Baltimore, Howard Street Tunnel. It's so old it's listed on the National Registry of Historic Places. It caught fire in 2001, some of you will remember. When it did, trains had to divert as far as Cincinnati to get to here. Okay? There's choke points like that all over the country, where relatively modest investment gives you incredible increase in capacity. In Chicago, rail lines come in from the east and the west. Historically, they were built by non-cooperating railroads, so they don't actually hook up, or don't hook up in enough places that these containers have to be unloaded, rolled across Chicago, downtown, and then put on another train. It takes 2 days, which is longer than it takes to go from Chicago to New York by rail. So that's the first order line of business, not just shovel-ready, shovel-worthy projects. Now I want to come to the really sort of cool stuff, sort of a Jules Verne version because it's Back to the Future in many ways. Rail fans will recognize this engine. As long ago as 100 years ago, the rhythmically named Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific had a line that went from Chicago all the way to Seattle. And as it crossed the Rocky Mountains and the Cascades, it had an amazing feature. It was an electrified line powered by hydropower, drawing on the region's abundant hydropower. You think about this. This is a zero-emission, zero-oil form of transportation that 100 years ago was capable of taking a 100-car train over the Continental Divide. This engine is a little more recent. It's got a kind of funny story as an aside. It's known as a Little Joe. The reason, it was originally built for Joseph Stalin, who had the foresight to electrify all the Soviet Union's electric railroads. He ordered up some of these, and at some point in the Cold War, things got hot, and they decided, no, you can't have them. So they went to the Milwaukee Road and served until just before the last oil crisis, hauling freight. And the railroad, unfortunately, didn't have the foresight to see what could be done. But there's a lot that could be done with electrification of railroads. Now, this is really cool, I think. This is really cool. First of all, if you electrify a railroad, you can power it by any source at hand, right? You can use wind, you can use solar, you can use hydro, you can use nuclear if you want to go there, and you can use existing coal, right? The other cool thing is these electric locomotives have a thing called regenerative braking. So when it puts on the brake, going down the grade, it converts kinetic energy that would otherwise be wasted. It goes back into the wire and helps pull this train up. So we're talking spectacular energy efficiency. Railroads also happen to be probably the most practical use to which to put wind power. The problem with wind power is most of the wind is not where the people are. But railroads go right by what wind farms we have. Not only that, these wind turbines are very large. They're very difficult to move anyway by rail. So what wind farms we're going to be building will mostly be near rail lines. Just to steal a little bit of the Millennium Institute's thunder, here's the bottom line on what you could get in their estimation for by today's scale, modest investment in electric rail. 38% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030, 16% or almost 17% in oil consumption, and of course, a bigger economy because these improvements in logistics have all kinds of economic effects. How hard is this to do? In the 1970s, when we were in an energy crisis, many thoughtful people came to this proposal. Many studies were done by the National Academies of Science. Milton Schaap, some of you remember, as the governor of Pennsylvania at the time, was a big advocate of this. Anyway, we know where the electric lines would go. In fact, we could start putting poles down right now, even before we've settled on what the ultimate power source is. Like I said, shovel ready, shovel worthy. I will let John talk about this in greater length, but the basic political deal here is public money going into private rail infrastructure. In return, public access of a type to be negotiated into rail capacity. Examples, commuter rail. Some ancillary benefits. Consumers, lower cost, lower transportation. There are a lot of items that used to go by train that don't, particularly perishables like fruit and vegetables coming out of California or Florida. It doesn't have a long shelf life. The trains are currently too slow. It all goes by truck. Enormous waste, enormous carbon footprint. With electric railroads and other increased capacity, railroads could win back a lot of that business. Same thing with express freight. 50 years ago, it wasn't uncommon for a family in the summer to take its refrigerator and give it to, or have our railroad express agency come pick it up, put it on a train, and deliver it to their lakeside cabin. Railroads are so inherently efficient due to their physics that they can handle very heavy loads. And you think about that next time you're paying $50 to bring back a suitcase of dirty laundry, right? Next thing is stuff like FedEx, right? 50 years ago, Pennsylvania Railroad's fast mail train number 11 could take a letter mailed in Manhattan with a 2-cent stamp and deliver it in Chicago the next day. Today, if you want to do the equivalent, you're going to probably wind up spending $17 to get FedEx to fly it to Memphis, sort it, and bring it back to Chicago. That's tremendous areas in fast freight. This project facilitates the coming of high-speed rail commuter with increased energy efficiency. We could have trains that to which people could put their automobiles, similar to Amtrak's Auto Train running between Lorton and Central Florida. And of course, we get tremendous improvements in environmental benefits. So the question is it pie in the sky? Can it be done? And I will say that certainly more than a year ago, before the consensus formed that some kind of big infrastructure spending was needed, we've gained a lot of ground. But it's important to notice, too, that we're not making any bets on new technology, and we're not bailing out a failing industry. We're investing in a growing industry so that it can achieve publicly desired results faster than otherwise. Also, in the special interest politics of freight, notice that trucking companies, the big trucking companies like J.B. Hunt, Schneider, they are now the railroad's biggest customers. They would like to have more rail capacity because they put their containers on these trucks on trains every chance they get. UPS is desperate to have enough rail capacity to be able to move parcels across the country in less than 4 days, because now they're using team tags of drivers, and it's unbelievably expensive in labor and fuel. So the other big thing that I would say to Obama about this project is its success doesn't depend at all on persuading a single human being to give up his car or to not take the plane. We will achieve all these benefits without that. Now, a lot of people may take advantage of the high-speed rail that could come with us, but this is not a high-speed rail proposal. This is for the transport system of freight. And that, I believe, is change we can believe in. Thank you.
And now we have, I don't know that we need me to introduce everyone, but
So Andrea's going to go.
Andrea, great,
And then we're going to tag team.
great. Andrea Bassi.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the Millennium Institute before leaving the floor to Alan Drake, and I'll be back with you for final remarks. The Millennium Institute is a small non-for-profit based in Arlington, Virginia, just next door. We have been working with about 45 countries in our 25 years of history so far, and we mostly focus on strategic planning. So we help governments or we help interested groups in dealing with longer-term policy issues. We always focus on longer-term sustainability, but still we tend to look at impacts, the causes of issues and the impacts that intended policies may have on both social, economic, and environmental dimensions. So we'll focus on this specific study today, and towards the end of the presentation, I'll show some broader implications of not really a proposal, but what I will define as a very provocative scenario that is intended to show some positive impacts and possibly get some positive comments to take it further. Thank you. So, Alan?
What would you pay for those results? You know, looking at it from a result-oriented point of view. You know, how much is this worth to the United States? I'm sorry. Okay, okay. So, how much are these results worth to the United States? And I can tell you that it's available for the bargain price of less than one AIG bailout per year. Now, what do you get for this? Now, let me back up just very quickly. The Millennium Institute models national economies all over the world, quite a portfolio. And they, in their spare time, modeled the U.S. economy and found that we're heading toward third world status. Now, Argentina, not Haiti, we're not going to be eating mud pies, but it's not a place we necessarily want to go. And they were saying, what policies can turn this around and get us greenhouse gases under control and do something from a national security point of view. And what they've come up with is three policies. One is renewable energy, and that was basically the ACORE plan. Urban rail on a massive build-out, even faster than what the French are doing today, and expand and improve and electrify the electric freight railways. And what I'm going to do here is peel the onion down to the freight railways. If you subtract renewable energy and you just do the urban rail and freight rail, this is what you come up with. Not quite as good, but worth the money, you know. And the price tag goes down, of course, too. And then getting to just electrified and freight rail lines. And quite frankly, these results astonished me. And we went into some detail as to the dynamics of how we got this. And Andrea will go into a bit more of this than I. He has a doctorate in it, and I don't. Now, when you're modeling stuff, you kind of do the maximum strength. You do the maximum possible effort. The Hirsch report, if you're familiar with that, postulates wartime effort. I don't think that you can get people to do stuff they do in wartime for mere money alone. But what I came up with is the idea of maximum commercial effort, which is the most you can get people to do for money. And until a few months ago, the best real-world example of that was developing the Alberta tar sands. And the oil companies were throwing as much money as they possibly could at boiling as much tar out of sand as they possibly could. What I'm proposing is we do a maximum commercial effort, and here is the laundry list. To the basic rail lines, we're talking $250 to $300 billion over 20 years. And I'll be glad to go back to this. I see people taking notes, and so let me dwell just a tad longer than I planned on this. One of them is their bottlenecks, which was mentioned earlier, and CREATE is the one that is around Chicago. Several billion-dollar project. I think it's $5 billion for CREATE. Oh, $2 billion, okay. Well, there's a CREATE 2 that I'm aware of, that once they get that done, they have a second set to do. And it's just basically removing bottlenecks and making things more efficient, but also includes electrifying. 2004 cost estimate was about $2.5 million a mile for double track to electrify, and if there was no unusual characteristics that would drive up the cost. So these, if you can afford an AIG bailout, these are not outrageous numbers for the benefits that result. I also have something which is semi-high-speed rail. This is not the bullet trains of Japan. It's not TGV in France, because that's passenger only or very light freight, like packages, letters. This is a compromise between the heavy freight that we have in this U.S. and what they do perhaps in Europe. It is running freight that is medium density. Fruits and veggies would be a good example. And delivering food is a worthwhile national security goal, by the way. Delivering at 90 to 100 miles an hour, and on the same tracks, run passenger trains 110, 115, maybe 125 miles an hour. And do this only in a condensed, smaller network, not on every rail line, but on the high-capacity, worthwhile rail lines. And to do such a network is also expensive. And I have the urban rail and the others points, which all are to the good. Not all of which were modeled. By the way, we never came up with a good model for increased bicycling, increased passenger rail. So the modeling numberings I'm showing are really an understatement of what we could do if we went pedal to the metal, maximum effort. I will point out that during World War II, national military policy was to run everything by rail. And there were some service impacts on that. Freight had priority over military personnel. Military personnel had priority over civilian personnel. That was the way it was in World War II. And they did everything they could by rail. And roughly 90% of the ton miles went by rail during World War II. And our goal over 20 years, it's not a tomorrow, this is a multiple effort, long-term effort, big bucks, is shift about 85% of the truck miles to rail. DoD, Transport Command, came up with a list of what they consider to be the strategically important rail lines. This fairly closely maps where the mainline rail lines are, except if there's two mainline rail lines side by side, the DoD said only one was strategic. But it gives you kind of a feel for what I mean when I say we're going to electrify about 36,000 miles of rail lines as a first step. I think you've seen this one before, and I think I know where Mr. Longman got this from. Ed Tennyson and I came up with, and this is still a work in progress, on the running the freight at 90 to 100 miles an hour and running passengers 110, 120 miles an hour, and the network that we are proposing. And this is not, it's still a work in progress, but it gives you at least a conceptual idea. Notice the California fruits and veggies, the Florida fruits and veggies have ways to go up there, and I think that may be one of the backbones of express freight. Before deregulation, virtually no fruits and vegetables traveled by rail. After deregulation, with the changes in rail behavior, it's up to 14–15%, I understand. Mr. Gray may correct me. We're looking for the vast majority. Now, here's some things to further go into the benefits of rail electrification. You can trade, if you move freight off of trucks and onto not just railroads, but electrified railroads. Many of them double stack. That means you get rid of the little wheels here and you put two of these on top of each other. You're doing roughly trading 20 BTUs of diesel for 1 BTU of electricity. And the benefits of that will reverberate through the economy in many subtle but very positive ways. There are no negatives. Now, one truth in PowerPoint, the real number may be somewhere between 17-1 and 21-1. Also, this is a contribution of theory of mine. If you were to ask a civil engineer what it would take to increase the capacity of the beltway around Washington, D.C. by 1/3 or 50%, the number would come in close to an AIG bailout. The more you use roads, the more expensive they get. The marginal cost keeps going up, up, up. But the converse is true of rail. The more you use rail, the more you expand capacity, with few isolated exceptions, the cheaper it gets. The marginal cost is less than the original cost. In simplest thinking, if you double track a rail line, instead of if you've got one track, you've got trains going this way, then trains going that way, then trains going this way. If you double track it and they just go like this as they please, you increase capacity by 3 or 4 times. And you also reduce the transit time that the shippers have to wait for their cargo to get delivered. And the cost is slightly less than doubling what the cost is for single track. So the more you use rail, the cheaper it is a good rule of thumb. Now, what percentage depends on the circumstances. And there are cheaper ways of increasing capacity, signaling, sidings, etc. People always ask, well, if we electrified, how much electricity are we going to use? I always point out that if we outlawed these hair dryers, which we really don't need, that we could run the existing electrified rail line, the New York City subways, Long Island Railway, Northeast Corridor, with the electricity we now waste on hairdryers. If we do not go the electric vehicle rate, France is about 2.3%, so they've got to give up something more than hairdryers. But in the USA 2030, we're in the neighborhood of 4% for both urban rail and electrified rail lines, but without electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are there. This is doable. I mean, this is not a massive change or distortion of our economy. So I'll turn it over to Andrea.
Thank you, Alan. So I'm back with some longer-term considerations and also looking at the problem or the opportunity from a systems perspective. So what we see here in this graph are mostly two sets of data, one for GDP and one for emissions. What we are showing here is the relative value with respect to the baseline scenario. So see GDP for two scenarios with electrified freight only and electrified freight plus renewable energy is growing. So these policies have positive impacts on GDP. On the other hand, emissions, plain lines, decrease, which is also positive for the environment and follows some of the goals for climate regulations. Of course, when we use renewable energy, the reduction in emissions is higher than when just electrifying freight. So until 2030, which is what Alan has shown also, everything seems to be okay. But let's take a longer term perspective. Let's focus on what happens after 2030 until 2050. Now, first of all, there are some feedback loops in the system that needs to be considered. The first one is GDP goes up, there is higher demand for energy in general. If we invest only in freight rail, the additional electricity needed will be generated mostly by burning coal, which over the longer term increases emissions. This is why the red line goes up after 2030. So we have to be careful we understand what are the dynamics underlying the system. Also, checking the blue line, where we add the renewable energy policy, we see that current renewable energy regulations projects investments, even massive investments, until 2030, which is where we are looking at renewable portfolio standards. After those projects phase out, the increase in GDP above business as usual requires more energy. And once again, we are going most probably to use coal because it's cheaper than any other energy source to produce electricity. We also have to consider that if we build renewable energy generation capacity, coal use will go down, which also will probably reduce the price. So we have to make sure we avoid oscillations over the longer term because, for instance, the steel, aluminum, chemicals and paper, energy-intensive manufacturing sectors may jump into the wave of low coal prices to make investments, which is good for the economy, which can help actually the rail sector. But at the same time, if coal prices go up in the future, they may face problems that will, of course, influence the rail sector as well. So we have to be careful here. Now, the second and last example is about oil consumption. Again, we have two scenarios, freight only and freight plus renewable energy. And the data results are shown relative to the business as usual scenario. So in both cases, we see oil consumption going down, which is positive. We are assuming fairly high prices for oil in the future. But what is surprising is that in the freight scenario only, as I mentioned earlier, coal prices will be fairly low. So electricity prices in general will be fairly low. And this favors the adoption or development of electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, and so on. So in that case, oil consumption will be lower, but we'll have some competition for the rail sector coming up. Maybe more efficient trucks, more efficient transportation, and so on. In the case of renewable energy, since we are not at the point where grid parity has been reached, probably electricity costs will be higher, which paves the road for the rail sector to develop without being too much in a rush, despite the fact that this is a very optimistic and challenging case. But at the same time, will help the longer-term development of other industries. For instance, smart grids and the integration of renewable energy into commercial and residential sectors. So there are both positive and negative effects. There are feedback loops and trade-offs that have to be considered in this case. Now, concluding, I think it's fair to say that there is no silver bullet to today's problems. There are many varied, there are short-term, medium-term, and longer-term problems. It's very complicated. But at the same time, it seems that electrified rail, especially when coupled with renewable energy, considering existing plans and government policies, is an excellent option. Now, whether this is feasible or not, it's another story. Still, this is very provocative. Also, we need to take into account potential side effects that may influence customers, so those who are going to use freight rail, or the same industries that could profit from it. But if we are able to identify those bottlenecks and those challenges early enough, we can then turn them into opportunities and make sure everything goes for the better. And we still have a positive economic growth, a reduction in emissions, and increasing employment all the way to 2050. So thank you.
I don't have any slides, but thank you very much for inviting me to come here today and have the chance to talk about rail in maybe a new framework, because as the head of STPP, we have just led the formation of a new coalition called One Rail. The idea behind it is to bring together for the first time rail interests from both the freight and the passenger side. And this is a critically important coming together, because it has not always been thus. And it greatly strengthens the ability to advance rail on a broader platform, if you will. And so a couple of weeks ago, we announced this coalition, and with 10 members, and there are now more people knocking at our door to join up as well. And what we want to do, and we are made up of environmental advocates, a group of bipartisan elected officials building America's future, some reform-minded transportation people such as STPP, and also a number of rail interests, AAR, APTA, Rail Supply, the short lines, so it's a very diverse group, and it's going to get even more diverse in the next short period of time as we expand our membership. What we really are calling for is that rail has got to be recognized as a critical element in our transportation system. How many times do you hear, and we've been hearing it in the last several months, if we got to fix our roads and bridges? Indeed we do, but it comes across as though that's the only transportation system we have in the United States. It's really time to recognize that rail is an integral component of a national transportation system. And so that's one of our objectives, is to just help people be aware of what rail does, what rail can do, and what it could do if we pushed even further to expand what it's doing today. We've been through, over the last number of years, as Phil pointed out, really shrinking, and only recently did we start to expand the rail infrastructure in this country. And clearly the survey work that we've done through STPP and the Transportation for America campaign, which we're actively a part of, has very good evidence that the public is looking for a better set of travel options. There is no doubt about it. They are crying for, and particularly last summer when the price of gas was as high as it was. So calling for the change, what does that exactly mean? Having a balanced discussion about moving freight. Freight finally has gotten onto the national radar screen. For years it was not at all really considered. Most state DOTs focused far more on the people moving side of the business and not so much on the moving goods side of the business. And but now with the growth in freight from the globalization of our economy, it has made a huge difference in what's happening in a number of key corridors, I-81 being only one of them. And so we feel very strongly that it's important to have a balanced discussion about how we address that. Because if we keep going in the direction that we have, there isn't enough balance, and it has huge environmental and energy issues for us, as has been pointed out. So I don't need to go into that at the moment. But through One Rail, what we want to do is expand and strengthen both the passenger network by encouraging the development of more commuter and intercity rail options for people, and really build out the system in the areas where it makes most sense to do that. That this will give us safer transportation, obviously far more environmentally and energy friendly, as well as improving overall service levels. So we think this is a very important element of the One Rail principles, which we have, and they're available on our website, which is www.transact.org. Secondly, we want to make sure that we are expanding both public and private ability to invest in rail, because we remember that the railroads are not owned by the public sector, they're privately owned, and they do raise their own capital, not enough of it, which is why I think we've seen a sea change within the rail industry. Back in 1993, I served on an intermodal commission, and the railroads that participated then were not particularly enamored of having public investment. 15 years later, we have a very different picture, and we see quite a bit of interest on the railroads in doing public-private partnerships. And clearly, when there is public investment, we need to be sure of what the appropriate public benefits are so that we can justify, and I think it's not hard to do that. We need to put it together in a way that makes public sector interests comfortable that we're putting public money into private assets. And finally, we were now initially looking for a dedicated funding source for states to invest in passenger rail. Phil and I testified earlier this week, and Will Kempton, who's the director of the California Transportation Department, indicated how much money California has put of its own into passenger rail. And they're one of the leading states in terms of investment, and it's paying off in growth of their ridership. They have 3 critical corridors that they have seen tremendous growth in over the last few years. The benefits we've talked about pretty well. I want to take a minute and talk just about some of my experience running the Delaware DOT. And I-95, the curse of that's driving so much onto I-81, is one of my roads in Delaware, and we love that toll booth, trust me. It produces a lot of money. And well, it's a good piece. I don't know how much it is now, but tolls in Delaware we have a very balanced set of revenue sources, and tolls are about 1/3 of the revenue that is earned in Delaware, and many of you pay some of that money. But we did electronic tolls, and so you should have Easy Pass, which makes it easier. But anyway, we faced a situation in Delaware. We wanted to expand commuter rail along the Northeast Corridor. And I was very frustrated because we were working with Amtrak. We couldn't put it in if we called it intercity, because it's not allowed under the current federal statutes. But commuter rail, you could do. So not having that flexibility was a great frustration to me. And many states don't have commuter rail options, but they have a need for intercity passenger. They can't use their federal money today to invest in intercity passenger rail. And you can find ways, although it's difficult to get through all the hurdles, to invest in rail freight improvements. But again, that's an area where we need to have much greater flexibility to make the best investment. And it's one of the things One Rail is pushing for as we go through both the economic recovery authorization process and the authorization process that will begin sometime this year. In addition to this lack of flexibility right now, we felt that it was really important to begin to document the kinds of improvements. So through the I-95 Corridor Coalition, which we were a critical part of, we invested in a study known as the Mid-Atlantic Rail Operations Study. And that identified over $6 billion. Phil mentioned the tunnel in Baltimore, with 5 DOTs and 3 railroads investing their funds for that. It's unfunded because there is no real good source for that. So we think that needs to change. In terms of, I won't take time now, but maybe we'll get a chance to talk about it. We think there are all kinds of opportunities coming up in this next authorization, as well as in the stimulus bill, to move the dial to get rail on the table as a critical part of our transportation infrastructure. And let me just stop with that, and we'll get into some more discussion.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's nice to be here, if for no other reason than, quite frankly, I had hoped that at some point in my career, I'd last long enough to actually have this debate. It's nice to be here because you're basically working with an industry that, for many years, certainly when I started in the industry, was very much in a survival mode, in which due to public policy primarily, a lot of the industry was in bankruptcy. And fortunately, those policies changed. Over the last 25 to 30 years, the industry's been able to dig itself out of that condition and is probably in a healthier financial condition and physical condition now than it's ever been in its lifetime in America. Now, having said that, there are lots of opportunities out there, and there are lots of opportunities to expand what the industry does, how it does it, how it interacts with the rest of the world. But at the same time, we have something that's functioning reasonably well right now, and is how do we nurture that to improve it in many respects. So, just to give you a little bit of background. This is what, even today, the industry looks like in terms of where it covers. There's been a lot of talk about the decline of the number of miles of the rail industry, and that decline is real. But the fact is, there's still a lot of railroad out there. It goes a lot of places. And the railroad that is out there today is much more heavily used than it was even 25 years ago. In fact, if you look at these lines today, they're generally hauling about twice as much traffic on average on the lines as they were 25 years ago, some of them as much as 10 times as much. Again, the basic core network is the 95,000 miles of Class 1 railroad. That's your real core. That's where most of the density is. That's where most of the freight is generated on this network. It's about a 50, this year it'll be about a $55 billion, in 2008 about a $56 billion industry. Now, to put that in perspective, yes, that's a lot of revenue for the rail industry, but we have customers, particularly some of the larger chemical and oil customers who have almost as much profit as we have revenue. So yes, it is a significant industry, it is a significant part of the freight industry, but at the same time, it's also, it is not a huge, giant industry in some of the U.S. traditions. What do we carry? What's out there on this? Well, the biggest thing that's emerged are these trailers on flat cars or containers on flat cars. That's become the biggest single source of revenue for the business. Coal, mostly for electric utilities. There's about 50% of the U.S. electrical power generation that's in that coal that is moved by rail out there. So that's the other big deal. Obviously, a lot of other things, food products, grains, chemicals, what have you. But those two are the big items. They tend to also be the items that are growing the most on the rail network and making the most demands on future capacity. We spend a lot of money in this business. We spend somewhere between 15 and 20% usually of our revenue on capital. Most American businesses spends 3 to 5% of their revenue on capital. But when you're maintaining networks that are comparable to highway systems that are private networks, you spend a lot to maintain that network. As we see here, the two largest railroads spend at about the same level as the state of California for their networks. So huge amounts of money going into annual operation of the network, just the maintenance and renewal of the network. Fortunately, we haven't let our network run down to quite the extent that the states have let some of their highway networks run down. Now, getting into the whole idea of public-private partnerships and what's out there, why would you do this? Why would the public be involved in anything like this? Well, reality for us is that there really are probably only three reasons why the public should get involved with public-private partnerships with privately owned freight railroads. One is to do things that we're never going to do ourselves. There are projects that are meaningful to the public, that there's some reason, there is some public need for them, there's some public desire for them, that are out there that have no economic basis, and the freight railroads are simply not going to do them. We do projects because there is going to be an economic return over time. We are private entities, we have legal responsibilities to our shareholders, that's how we have to work. So, number one, public-private partnerships do things that we would never do ourselves. Number two, undertake projects that don't look very good on the return basis for us. We might someday think about, but that don't look very good on the return, but that for the public have a lot of value. Kind of a variation on number one. And number three, the other reason is to change the timing on what we'll do. There are some things, we're like everybody else that has large networks, that has a lot of infrastructure to take care of. There's thousands of projects out there that you could undertake on our infrastructure. There are thousands of things that could be done. There are thousands of things that are out there that probably over time will make some economic sense. But like everybody else, we're constrained on the amount of capital we have. As you've heard earlier, there are real constraints when you're in the private sector on how much capital you can spend. We spend more than most people do, but the fact is that you still have serious constraints on what that is. And so the fact is that there are things that you want to change, that the public may want to change the timing on to get a project going that means something to the public, but it's a lot lower down on the scale for the railroad business. What constitutes win-win partnerships for us? Well, from our perspective, it's things that enhance goods movement. It's things that offset capacity, the impacts to capacity, and things that provide a fair return for our shareholders, not just for the project itself, but over time. We're in the long-term business. We are not in business for the immediate capital project. We have to be around, we've been around for 140 years. We do that by thinking longer term and keeping the business oriented towards longer term. What should the public be getting out of these things? They need some clearly identifiable public benefits. And let me tell you, the whole concept of putting together public-private partnerships, if you've ever done it, all of it centers around who and what is getting what benefits from each of the projects. How are those benefits structured? How are they meaningful for the players in there? There need to be fully identified funding sources that come from the public. One of the things that the railroad industry has gotten a really graphic lesson on for a long time is that you want to be really leery about trusting the public as having a funding source. Amtrak demonstrates this for us every year in the torture that those poor people go through trying to pull together a budget to try to do projects and try to put themselves in a position to do long-term projects. So you want to be real careful from our perspective about whether funding sources are available to support projects long-term. The public is not too good about doing that sometimes. Finally, the public needs to be accomplishing its own mobility objectives through these things. Now, let's go on through the other things here, and let's talk about one other thing. We've heard a little bit about the benefits of the rail industry and some of the things that can happen on it. One of the things that's important to us is the whole area of fuel utilization. Now, if you look in terms of the freight that's handled in the U.S., we handle about just a little over 40% of the freight ton miles that are handled in the United States today, moved by rail. To do this takes about 8% of the fuel that is used for freight purposes. Now, if you look at this in terms of the total fuel for transportation purposes, it's actually only about 2%, because the vast majority of fuel goes to the private automobile, as you might expect. But again, we have a lot of leverage. We've talked about all the types of leverage of getting value from the rail system for the public, and a lot of that comes from simply strategies which move freight onto the rail system, because you move it at so much more efficient fuel utilization rates than you do anywhere else. Now, how have we gotten here? Well, in the past 25 years, we've just about doubled the fuel efficiency of the locomotives, of the way we use the network out there. We've gone from about 200 ton miles per gallon up to about 436 recently on ton miles per gallon. We expect 2008, when we get the numbers in, will probably be a little bit better than that. So we've done a lot of little things to improve fuel efficiency. I would emphasize that this is really kind of the pattern that we're going to have to look to as a nation to improve this. There are no home runs in here to get there. There are a lot of little things, better training, little changes in technology, not dramatic changes, little changes here and there, improvements in metallurgy, improvements in the transmission systems in our electric transmission systems, our locomotives. Lots of little things that went to contribute to doubling the fuel efficiency of what we do today. So that today we can haul double what we did 25 years ago on exactly the same amount of fuel that we did back then. It's a big deal. It's what the whole growth in fuel improvement technology is all about, and it's one that we want to keep going in the future. Finally, capacity, and what you can do to add to these systems. About 2 years ago, a year and a half ago now, we had some work done for the US DOT that our organization commissioned on what it would take to increase capacity to handle the same percentage of rail freight 30 years from now that we're handling today. Looked at the network today to see where the capacity constraints were. They got a lot worse if you didn't add a lot of capacity to the network. But again, for about 135 to 145, 150 billion dollars, you can solve this problem. We have 30 years to do it. Now, what that doesn't do, and what we're looking at now in other work, is what happens if you increase the rail share. Instead of it just staying constant over those 30 years, what happens if you increase it? We don't have the answer on that yet. That's something that we're still working on. But the bottom line is that for about half of what one of the highway budgets was this last round, for about less than $150 billion, you can basically do a huge amount to increase rail capacity. It doesn't get to the issue of electrification. That's a useful add-on at some point, but it doesn't get to that. It's simply the physical track capacity that you have to use. But the fact is that we are a relatively cost-efficient solution to bringing a lot of capacity to the movement of freight in the U.S. With that, go and get to the questions.
Well, thank you, everyone. We want to open this up to the audience here, but let me just start her off. And one thing I didn't hear about that I presume a benefit that I presume we get out of all this is for us drivers, people who are on the highways. I presume that if you, over 20 years, I think it was, 30 years, you take in your maximum 20 years, 85% of the long-haul trucks off the highways. What does that do for commuters on the Beltway? Is this something we're going to feel? Is this worse congestion we're not going to have? Exactly how does that work? And please, for everyone, I'd like you to use your microphones, because this is going to be recorded, and also for the audience, when you do ask a question, please state your name and your affiliation.
Okay, we did do the maximum strength case. And basically, we looked at what is the maximum number of trucks we can get off. And part of that is simply reducing the number of truck deliveries. Rail spurs relocate warehouses to rail spurs. Walmart has built an entire network of warehouses that are serviced only by trucks. We're assuming that over a 20-year period with lots of money and very high oil prices, and one aside I did not mention in my speech is the stimulus package includes a $30 billion subsidy to the trucking industry to repair the roads they tore up. Nice. And make them pay for the damage they do. And yes, you will see far fewer trucks on the road. Now, if you also build out urban rail, using the carrot instead of the stick, if you will. DC Metro could be expanded, light rail, there are several proposals in the area, blah, blah, blah. This will also reduce the number of miles traveled by people in cars, but also you reduce cars, you reduce trucks, you reduce the wear and tear, which the damage the truck does to the roads is proportional to the fifth power of the axle weight. So cars do almost no damage. All these repairs are due to trucks and weather/salt. So you will also not only have less congestion, you will have better quality roads to go on because the repairs will last longer.
Fewer trips to Meineke. Do we have some questions here? Oh, I'm sorry, we have, please.
I would like to add one point quickly. It's more or less proven. We have many cases in which expanding street capacity or removing traffic from a street or a very busy highway leads more cars to get into that highway because it takes less time to get where you want to go. So it's very important that we take into account passenger rail projects to support the shift from taking the car to go to that specific place to using rail. Yes. And that has to do with the time it takes, with the price, and so on.
Can I just add one thought here? Land use is an issue that has come up particularly on the passenger side and transit-oriented development. We have not really begun that conversation at all on the commercial, industrial, manufacturing side of things. That is a huge issue, the distribution and how we've organized that and how that generates the demand for transportation. And that's an area where I would suggest we need to do an enormous amount of work.
Yeah, I think it's important that we realize, too, that rail, while it's a useful solution to address some problems, it's not a cure-all. That keep in mind that for trucks and the truck trips that are out there, about 75% of all truck trips are less than 150 miles in length. And quite frankly, you're not going to take those truck trips off the road with rail service. That's not going to happen. The cost of doing that is just beyond anything that makes sense for either the economics of the underlying freight that's being moved or the carriers themselves. So to bring a little realism to it, what we're talking about with rail is dealing with the longer haul trucking issues. That's where we can work. That's where we can bring some value. Now there are 25% of the trucks out there are closer to 10% of them are still there's still a lot of trucks. That's still a lot of business out there. But I think we do need to recognize that that you're not going to address the short haul, what is basically urban or intra-urban movement of trucks by rail solutions. That gets a lot more back to what Ann was talking about in things like land use.
One graphic example of John's 150 miles. The Delmarva Peninsula raises a lot of chickens. You all eat chicken, right? There's about 1,000 trucks a night that come off the Delmarva Peninsula taking chickens to various markets. We had no idea about that till we started repaving I-95. All hell broke loose because we were messing up their schedules. Those trips are very unlikely to ever get on a railroad because the distances and the time to market is just not going to work. But they also are not generally on the road when all of us are trying to get to work. So it's a challenge.
There is an irreducible minimum on trucks, but if you model a much higher oil price scenario, then things that are not economic today, that are not practical today, you develop more innovation in the rail industry. And there are other examples elsewhere. New Orleans is building a new frozen poultry processing plant on the river, right next to a rail line. They're not planning to include a rail siding because they're getting chickens from Mississippi and they're going 100 miles, 150, 200 miles to the rail poultry processing. However, there are historic examples where when trucking was more expensive in comparison to rail, where such movements were made by rail. And the question is, will we become innovative? Will the railroads change their operating philosophy? And the slide that was deleted did say that there is going to have to be, for this maximum impact, have to be a revolution in rail management and rail service. Now, we can get to a good percentage of that and everybody will concur that it should be done, and that's what we should do first. But there are ways of moving chickens 200 miles by rail, but not with the current management practices that are developed by the railroads. It will require a revolution.
Yes, please. This gentleman right here. Again, state your name and your affiliation.
Yeah, Mike Olshausen, Contemporary Review. It seems that many of the advantages of rail that you've spoken of are advantages because rail transport isn't trucking transport. It's just a different mode. But address something about the difference between diesel rail and electric rail. Say something within the rail context.
Okay.
What are the advantages of diesel rail? What's the existing stock like? And what kind of a trade-off do you have between?
Well, working on the heels of Joseph Stalin, the Russians electrified the Trans-Siberian Railway in 2002. They run by electricity from Moscow to the Pacific Ocean over the world's most militarily and economically strategic rail line. The rule of thumb, and there's a little bit of debate on this, but not much, is that electrification increases capacity of a rail line, just merely electrifying, by about 15%. If you run commuter trains, they run about 15% faster if you electrify them. So there's that benefit. Also, there are benefits in heavy grades. Electric trains can, and I go into quite a bit of technical detail, electric trains can oftentimes handle steep grades a little better than regular rail lines. But there is a very large invested, the U.S. railways have put a major investment in modern diesel locomotives. And it is not in in my view, not in the national best interest for us to run every last one of those into the ground over 30 years. But that is where Mr. Gregg and I may disagree.
Well, first of all, as far as to the Russian example, quite frankly, the Russians, when they were electrifying and continue to, were using basically 1939 American diesel technology at the time, which was copied from locomotives that were sent to Russia during World War II. And so there was a nice, healthy economic curve for them to work with on that. That same curve doesn't exist. That same gap doesn't exist with the technology that's in place in the U.S. today. I'd emphasize that even as aggressive, say, as the French are being on electrification, that the new locomotives that are being bought for France, in fact, they're moving even as we speak here, are a North American model produced by Electromotive in London, Ontario, that is standard in American railroading and has been for many years, but is far, far advanced over anything that is in Europe as far as diesel technology. So there's a wide gap between what drove some of the economics of electrification in Europe versus what would drive it here. That we've spent a lot more time developing that technology. We've spent a lot more time in refining it to a much higher level than it's been achieved overseas. Now, one of the things you have to remember is that most places in the world, a diesel locomotive is just like a truck. It has a mechanical drive system just like a truck does. Not true in North America. In North America, the diesel locomotive is an electric drive system, an electric transmission system, which adds infinitely to the productivity of the locomotive. It adds a huge amount to the ability of it to operate efficiently, and is one of the things that drives a lot of the fuel efficiency that we see out of the American diesel locomotive that you will not see overseas in other places. Quite frankly, we're already working with the most advanced diesel locomotive technology anywhere in the world, and it makes the economics of the jump from diesel technology to electric technology a lot smaller here, and the advantages of electric technology just for economic purposes a lot smaller here than it would anywhere else in the world. And in fact, because of the high cost of installing electric technology, none of our members have been able to come up with an economic case that justifies electric technology per se at this point in time.
I would have a very quick question to follow up. Would what you said hold true if we consider oil prices to go up to maybe $150, $180 per barrel in the next maybe 10 years?
You know, clearly there is a point at which fuel prices drive you into looking at alternatives. I know that last summer a lot of our members started dusting off the studies that had been done a few years, actually a couple decades ago, and started looking at them. The findings last summer were that it was going to take a little bit more than what we saw then before it started generating the kind of returns that would be necessary to spend private money on electrification. Now, if there are public values, if there are public security reasons for getting into that, if there are public reasons for getting into the whole energy security issue, and as well added to the economic reasons, that's a very, very different world. And so we need to consider what the real driver is before we start thinking in terms of spending many, many billions of dollars on the electrification process.
On the economic calculations, how much does you pay? Railroads pay no taxes on their diesel. You know, they run it on their own railroads. They buy it straight from the refinery, don't see the tax man. But if they put up electrification, they have to pay property taxes on the electrification infrastructure. And in the economic calculations, how important are these property taxes?
Actually, very small in terms of they're real. It's a real issue, but the real impact of something like the property taxes is relatively small. I will tell you that other than the initial capital investment, which is huge, the real inhibitor that becomes very, very expensive is the fact that you have to electrify very, very large portions of your network before the economics start making sense. Locomotives, if you look at the electrifications that took place back around the turn of the century, typically back then a locomotive went 100 to 150 miles, and they changed the locomotive, steam locomotive, and put on another one. Went for 100, 150 miles, it was changed again, and while they serviced it, and the electric locomotives could run longer distances. That's not the case today. With the power that's out there now, it's not unusual for it to run transcontinental. And 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 mile runs are not unusual. And so you get very, very high levels of utilization from these locomotives. You have to be able to get those same types of levels of utilization from electric power for it to make economic sense. And that becomes one of the bigger barriers. That whole utilization issue becomes a big barrier to effective utilization of electrics. You can't just electrify 100 miles or 200 or 500 and have it make much sense or have it be very economic. Again, you may do it for reasons other than economics, but for economics, you have to have a very large portion of your network electrified for it to make sense.
Can we pass the mic down this way to Phil?
Well, I just want to emphasize that there's huge social returns to be considered in cost benefit. And when you say economics, we need to distinguish between the individual railroad's bottom line, return on investment hurdle, versus the effect on the overall economy as we realize these tremendous savings in logistics and energy use. That's all I'd like to say.
There's a gentleman in the very back.
Yes.
I'm David Foster.
Yeah, Mr. Foster, hold on, we'll get you the microphone.
Sorry. Thank you, Seth. I'm David Foster, Executive Director of Rail Solution. I would like to ask John Gray, if I could, a follow-up. I've noticed in the past that there seems to be considerable reluctance by the Class 1 carriers to accept public money. And there's been a variety of reasons for this that I don't think we need to go into today, but it includes the fear of the perspective that there might be too many strings attached. That's what Jim Young said on Wednesday when Congressman Nadler needled him at the hearing about accepting public money. He used a sort of a generic rejection technique of saying that there was too many strings attached. How do we get around this historical antipathy of the Class 1 carriers to work on public-private projects? Can we negotiate a successful arrangement where both interests are successfully served and preserved?
I think it's very possible to negotiate arrangements where it can be done. I've been involved in projects myself where we have put together public and private money to accomplish a goal. Typically, the real need is for the public to come to the table, one, with clear objectives and a clear understanding of what its own benefits are and a willingness to pay for those benefits. And that sounds simple, but it's not. For those of us that have been around the project in Chicago that was mentioned earlier, the project to improve the infrastructure, not just for the rail system, but for the whole urban transportation system in Chicago. By far the most difficult part of that whole project, other than getting the public funding in place, by far the most difficult part of the negotiation that led up to that project was identifying the public benefits and identifying who within the public actually was getting those benefits and how those would be divided with the public. Now, what were the public benefits that were involved in this? They were very large benefits, and in fact, when you looked at the public benefits versus what the rail carriers would receive in benefits, it tended to dwarf the rail benefits. And the public benefits were things like better mobility within the city, lower emissions, lower pollutant production for freight and people moving around the city, the ability to improve lifestyles in the city by minimizing the impact that the rail lines had on the public. So there were huge public benefits like that, but those are not easy to quantify. They're not easy to understand, and they're not easy to put into place and to get funding for. the process, it was fairly easy for the rail carriers to identify what they thought would be the benefits. It was things like that were talked about earlier: getting through town better, eliminating the time that it would take to get trains across the city of Chicago. There are a lot of costs associated with that the railroads, quite frankly, are used to identifying and used to quantifying on a routine basis, because that's how they make their capital decisions in the first place. So it was fairly easy for the rail industry to identify those benefits. It's much more difficult to identify the social benefits. And I think Phil mentioned that there is a social benefit equation that we have to understand in this business, because we do interact broadly with the public and the public interest. And so there is a need to understand this, but it's not something that tends to be very easy to do.
I think we got time for maybe one more question. The lady back here. Microphone's coming your way.
My name is Welmoed Laanstra. I'm a public art curator, and so I'm a little bit of a different angle, coming in from a different angle. But my big question for you is as the American economy has been propelled forward by consumption and the delivery of goods, as we are looking to going from more the global delivery of goods and we're focusing on local delivery of goods, how does that affect the plans that have been put forward by Phil? And I was kind of interested in your approach to that.
Did you say Phil or Alan?
Yeah, no,
I'm so sorry, I got distracted here for a second. I didn't hear your question.
My question is that I said most of Americans' economy has been propelled forward by the consumption and delivery of goods. I went to the Brookings Foundation 2 weeks ago when they had the presentation about infrastructure by Rendell, and Governor Rendell kept on pushing towards the delivery of goods and creating more infrastructure. My big question is America's economy is going to have to change. How would that impact, as we're going from global economy and the delivery of goods and the consumption of goods, how is that going to affect your proposal as we might have no goods to be transported in the end?
Well, that's a tough one. The capacity problem on rail is much improved in the last few months because of the downturn on the economy. But there's every reason to believe that we will get through this, and on the other side, I think we will have an economy that is much less based on borrowing from abroad, much more based on thrift, much more based on building stuff for ourselves instead of importing it. And railroads are really integral to the rebuilding of America's industrial base. And part of the reason we had this modal shift is we deindustrialized. And Walmart is all they're doing is taking containers from some ocean-going ship and doing a warehouse. They don't need rail. But if we make our own stuff, we're going to need it very much.
In my view, the one reason the United States is heading, remember, the motivating factor of this for the Millennium Institute is they were showing the U.S. is trending toward becoming a third world country. And that's not particularly shocking news to most thoughtful Americans. And a big part of that is we're like a business that is being run not to maximize profit, but to maximize cash flow, maximize consumption. And I've seen the numbers. I believe that our consumption's about 2/3 of the economy, 67% of the economy. Investment has trended down from 15%, 13%, pushing down towards 11%. We need to, quite frankly, consume less and invest more, but make sure our investments are done so effectively. And it may require a shift, a modal shift, if you will, of our economy with less consumption, more investment. And I think, quite frankly, it will lead to a better society in the long run.
I would like to add one quick comment. From an economic point of view, what we're going through now is probably the consolidation of those players, industries that can perform what they do very effectively with low costs. So your point of view is very much longer term. In the short term, what is going to happen is probably the opposite, because there is no structure to self-sustain the industry in the US at the moment. There is heavy reliance on China and other exporting countries into the US. But for the longer term, it might be that all the stimulus package that is investing into infrastructure and so on will create the framework, sort of the basis for a more distributed industrial setting in the US. In that case, the consequences of this plan will be that we need to have more efficient and transfer goods faster. Maybe we will not need huge trucks, but still we will need to move them around because there will always be some key local producers and some major producers in the US.
I believe we're out of time, so I want to, on behalf of New America Foundation and the Washington Monthly, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Ann Canby, Andrea Bassi, Alan Drake, John Gray, and Phil Longman. Thank you.